Biden could be remembered as a very bad president indeed.
Hello and welcome to GB News America. My name is Stephen Edginton. Is Joe Biden one of the worst presidents in US history? To discuss, I'm joined by the author and columnist Christopher Caldwell. Thank you so much, Christopher, for joining us.
I'm happy to.
So can you answer that first question? Is he one of the worst presidents so far?
I'd say probably, but only because the country is going through a period now where it's very hard to really get things done and win the confidence of the American people. I'd say that with the partial exception of Barack Obama, the last four presidents have got very little done. Biden has been very energetic. He's passed a lot of legislation. He came out of the COVID emergency and passed an extra stimulus bill. He had a lot of Democratic interest groups behind them. He was able to hold them together for 2 years and pass extremely expensive social spending and economic stimulus, particularly on green energy. So far, he's stimulated the economy a lot, and he's kept his coalition together, which is good. But he's done it in such a way that he's kind of given hostages to fortune. We have been totally reckless about our deficits and our debt, which now stands at $34 trillion. We've passed through a long period when low interest rates have made debt less worrisome than it traditionally is, but we're not in that era anymore. And this shows signs of maybe getting out of control. And should it come to threaten the reserve currency, which is the privileged institution on which a lot of America's wealth rests, then Biden could be remembered as a very bad president indeed.
You talk about Biden being energetic, and he certainly has passed a lot of legislation, but as a man, as a character, perhaps less energetic.
Yeah, he, he's an old man. I mean, I don't know what his temperament is, but he's having a good deal of difficulty, managing the physical demands of the job. That's pretty clear.
Is this unprecedented in US history to have someone who is so old and perhaps, and I don't want to be mean, but perhaps not with it? I mean, you see some videos of him and clips, and he just talks absolute nonsense.
Well, I'd say the closest thing was in Woodrow Wilson's second term. He had a stroke, and he was largely incapacitated for the last couple of years of his presidency. And the country was run at first by his aide, Colonel House, but then by his wife, unbeknownst to the public. So, yeah, we have had this before, and not that makes it a good thing. But
are you not concerned about this, because America faces so many threats, not just domestically, internationally, and yet the person who's nominally in charge doesn't seem to have everything there in terms of his mental capacity?
I don't know if you need everything. Like a president doesn't have to be sharp as a tack. And I'm often reminded of something that Walter Bagehot wrote in his book about banking, which is called Lombard Street. And he said that people in England tended to complain that bankers get up they go into the office at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then they leave for lunch at 2 in the afternoon, and they never come back, and it's a very easy job. And Bagehot said, that's good. He said, banking should be easy, because if it's hard, it's wrong. It's one of these things where you want this, there's a lot at stake here, so you want this top job to be something that a simpleton can do. So I think that Biden thus far has been adequate, certainly been adequate to the task of being president. But of course I'm worried about this. I mean, he's going to be 5 years older if he gets reelected at the end of his term. And that's really pushing it.
You talk about Woodrow Wilson's wife running the country and Americans not being aware of what was going on. There is an issue with democracy here, isn't there? Because if you vote for a president, you want to know that he's the one making the decisions ultimately. And at the moment, it seems there's a situation where there are people behind Biden who are running the show, or at least having a lot of influence, that perhaps don't get the kind of scrutiny or the accountability that a president should have.
I think that's absolutely right. And to really understand this, we need to go back to how the Biden coalition was formed in 2016. I mean, there were two ideas that were, in 2020. There were two ideas that motivated Democratic consultants coming out of 2016. One was people really love Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party, and he could very easily become the nominee. But people who are not in the Democratic Party tend to think of him as a socialist and even a communist. So he can't get swing votes, so he can't win the presidency. I think that might have been a mistaken judgment, but that was the judgment of the Democrats. And the other thought was that Hillary was just a terrible candidate. She really turned people off. And so the wise men in the party thought, someone like Biden, who's like, he's the image of the Democratic Party when it was a working man's party in the Kennedy era. That's what we need. And so they put him up as a candidate, and nobody liked him. Nobody liked him. He went through 4 primaries. I don't think he even got a delegate. And so finally the Democrats came together. Once he'd won the South Carolina primary, which is a primary that you can win by pretty much corralling the black vote, which makes up 60% of the South Carolina Democratic electorate. Once he'd won that primary, the party leaders said to the other candidates, "Okay, go. We'll make a deal with you. You'll get something out of this." So Buttigieg went, and he became Secretary of Transportation. Amy Klobuchar went. She delivered the inaugural address when Biden became president. They couldn't give her a cabinet position because they couldn't certainly keep her Senate seat. Michael Bloomberg dropped out. Everyone dropped out, and so suddenly Biden was there alone. But he barely made it to the nomination. To get him there required making deals with this very fractious Democratic Party. You remember we were in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter. There's a certain wing of the Democratic Party that, as we can now see in Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, that takes America's foreign engagements very seriously, and is almost like Bush-like in its desire to project power. There are businessmen. There are women. They're just there's a complex coalition that you have to keep together. And what Biden has basically done is given them everything, and that's why the government has been so expensive. That's why we've been running up the debt in the course of his presidency.
You talk about the process as to how Biden won that nomination in 2020 and how he was unsuccessful in so many primaries, how he was unpopular. Perhaps even more surprising, or taking that theme to an even more extreme, was his vice presidential pick, Kamala Harris, who was actively, disliked by many voters. She didn't win too many. I don't think she won any primaries from my memory. So how do you rate Harris? How would you compare her to other vice presidents throughout US history? What's her legacy going to look like?
She hasn't really done much in the vice presidency, but the idea of picking her seemed like a pretty good one. I mean, there are two things that strike me as indispensable parts of the Democratic coalition, and one is Democrats are the party of civil rights, and so the Democrats must remain popular among black people. Democrats are also the party of the new economy, of the tech world, which means they need to remain popular among venture capitalists in California. And Kamala Harris is like the ideal candidate you would draw up for that. You know what I mean? She just looked perfect on paper. And although her politics are not really to my taste, she could really deliver a good kind of stem-winder speech in the Senate. There was reason to think she'd really fire people up. And her failure to connect with Americans is kind of a mystery.
But it's more than a failure to connect. I mean, if you look at her opinion poll ratings,
Yeah.
she is very, very unpopular.
And it's surprising. She seems less popular than you would expect among women, I believe.
If you watch videos of her talking or doing interviews, she comes across so fake. Do you not think?
I've seen many. I've seen many of them, and I have a tendency to distrust those videos because, a politician is talking all day long, and in the age of YouTube, it's easy to take the stupidest thing a person says in any given day and turn it into who he is. You know what I mean? And so, yes, I definitely have seen Kamala Harris saying, the thing about the thing is it's the thing, and that kind of getting caught up, tripping over her words. But that doesn't really bother me so much, I have to say.
Do you think the general grade of US politicians has declined in the last 20 years? I mean, we could compare Harris perhaps to Nixon when he was vice president in the 1950s, or I don't know. I'm sure there are other examples of politicians who perhaps seem to loom greater over the age.
Yes, well, there have been some duds in the vice president's office. I mean, Nixon went on from being Eisenhower's vice president to himself picking Spiro Agnew as his vice president, who went to jail during his term in office. So you can screw up. Yes, I do think the caliber of politicians has fallen a little bit for a couple of reasons. One, I think that there's been a lot of competition from business and tech. I mean, the smartest kid in every high school in the United States in 1935 probably wanted to be president. Now he wants to, be a billionaire tech manager, or so it seems to me. Another thing is, with media the way it is, and the internet the way it is, it's very hard for a politician to have any privacy at all, particularly during a campaign. And so if you become if you become a politician, there's a lot of scrutiny into the life you've lived until then, and of the life that you and your family will be forced to live when you enter the public eye. And you can say, well, if you're going to have a position of trust, that's only right, but it's excessive. And I think you read a lot of stories about like there's a guy named Charlie Halleck of Indiana, and he used to have a little room in a hallway in the Senate, and he'd invite several senators in there, every afternoon, and they'd crawl out of that place. I mean, they'd be so drunk they could not walk out of the Senate, and no one ever said anything about it, and that kind of thing. I mean, I'm not saying that's my ideal of a responsible politician, but I do think you're going to get a lower level of politician if you intrude too much into their lives.
I'm sure you can read a presidential biography of probably most presidents in the 20th and 19th centuries and read the reality of their private lives and the sort of corruption that's going on there. And if there was anywhere near the amount of scrutiny that there is today towards a figure like Lyndon Johnson, for example, I'm sure he would never, ever have made it to the presidency.
And that was a big complaint of Richard Nixon when he wound up getting thrown out of office for conduct that he, not really wrongly, felt that Johnson had engaged into.
Do you think that conservatism died after the Second World War?
That conservatism died after the Second World War.
Let me explain that. So the writer Yoram Hazony, the Israeli philosopher, wrote a book called National Conservatism, A Rediscovery, a couple of years ago now. But he makes the argument that liberalism as an ideology became the dominant ideology after the Second World War. And he said that conservative ideas, conservative values, particularly from his perspective as a nationalist, died because they were associated with Nazism, with the Holocaust. And he makes the argument that those values, that ideology, essentially was wiped off the political kind of map after the Second World War. So I guess you disagree with that, but
no, I don't. I like a lot that Yoram Hazony writes, but I don't see the chronology like that at all. I think the real great conservative current in American life is an idea that's basically an English, democratic current, which is the idea of a yeomanry, which passes through Thomas Jefferson, and it holds that the people can, make their own decisions according to their common wisdom, and that this should be done at the most local level possible, come what may. And that sometimes had some ugly results, like half the country was owned slaves, at the time of the Civil War. But I think the Civil War was fought over more than slavery. It was fought over this idea of yeomanry, which is like, we can't have anyone like out there doing his own thing in any state of the country, okay? And so what Lincoln did was consolidate a national government. And that's actually the Civil War is the beginning of it's kind of the end of conservatism, but it's the beginning of nationalism for the United States. And at that point, the country was just consolidating itself. It had work to do. It was very forward-looking. You had, and it was basically run by sort of crony capitalist railroad barons in the late 19th century, who were challenged and neutralized by progressives in the early 20th century. And then you had the New Deal, which Reagan overthrew. But in all of this, there's not really so much that you would call conservatism. I would say the guy who understood this best was a political scientist named Louis Hartz, who wrote a book about 75 years ago in which he argued the United States doesn't really have conservatism as Europeans understand it. European conservatism has to do with the throne, the altar, and ordered hierarchy. And we've never had that. What happened in the United States is that you had under circumstances of colonization, you had a trading population that was basically Whig through and through, which was able to overthrow its opposition. And so you have a Whig country. You have this country is liberal in its very conception. And so generally, it's been very hard for really left-wing ideas or for really right-wing ideas to find any purchase here. And that really includes, look, after the Second World War, I think that was the moment when people actually tried to bring them back. When, Robert Taft, the senator from Ohio, said, okay, now we can come back and cultivate our garden. We don't want to go out on these foreign adventures anymore. Let's build up this country. We've got things to do, and we need to pare down the state. But I think that's no, I don't see the World War II as the last act of conservatism.
What do you think the impact of that war, of the gas chambers, of the memory of Auschwitz, of the memory of the horrors was on the political sphere in America and across the Western world. Obviously, we saw out of the Second World War, many institutions were born, like the United Nations and so on. And I think the reason Yoram is arguing that, and it's partly because he and many others, including you, have tried to explain what the hell went wrong since the 1960s, and Yoram argues since the 1940s, in Western countries. To get to the situation where we are today, there are so many conservative writers, Peter Hitchens and so on, have tried to explain in so many different ways how we have declined so much in terms of social values to be in the situation we are today. So can you just comment a bit about, as I said, on the Second World War, what do you think the impact was on politics? And maybe you can talk about your own explanations of how things have changed since the 1960s.
You mentioned the Holocaust. There's a very interesting book written in the 90s, I think, by a historian, I think his name was Peter Novick, called The Holocaust in American Life, which showed something very interesting, which was, obviously, people didn't go into World War II thinking it was about the Holocaust, although they had an understanding of that there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. But after the war, it took a very long time, in the United States certainly, for people to get the full, to really get this through their heads, what had happened in World War II. And I would say that when they did, it was in the 1960s. And so it tended to mix together with a kind of a general understanding of racism and that kind of thing. I think it's been important, but I don't think it's really been decisive. And I think it's been decisive in certain European countries in changing, it's certainly created a certain distrust of the public, a certain worry about what the public will do if left unattended. But I don't think it's the critical factor in the United States. I think that what happened in the United States is, there were two countries that really absolutely triumphed in the Second World War, and that was the United States and the Soviet Union. And then there were two countries that came out of the Second World War with a relatively clean moral balance sheet. That was the United States and Britain. So the United States was tops, both in its power and in its clean conscience. And the United States thought it could do anything. And that is the hubris where I think our big problem came from. And so the attitude in the late 50s, when the Russians were the first to put a satellite into space, was utter shock, And that was just, and that's what led to the huge increase in funding to the Defense Department that ultimately resulted in DARPA and the internet and in the funding to universities and that kind of thing. So we thought we were it. We were, we could do anything. And so when we got into the 1960s, and no one believed this more than Lyndon Johnson, we got into the 1960s, he sort of like Lyndon Johnson looked at the race problem and he heard all of these people saying, really be careful. He said, people were saying, some really good minds have been trying to figure this out desperately for the last 3.5 centuries, and they haven't been able to do it. Don't rush into this. And Johnson said, we're the United States of America. By the way, this is something very similar happened with the Vietnam War, sort of like the Vietnamese were misbehaving and we didn't really have any reason to go over, but you could create an incident in the Tonkin Gulf and then you send a few of our, planes over to bomb them and that'd knock some sense into them. And, if that didn't work, then we could wipe those guys out. I mean, there was just this galloping hubris, this idea that the country was so powerful and so good that it could remake humanity in all its aspects. And that's where I think the problems that we discuss today really had their beginning.
How much do individuals matter in that story that you tell in your great book, The Age of Entitlement? When you look at people like JFK, when you look at people like Lyndon Johnson, how much does it matter that Johnson became president? How much does it matter that JFK died in 1963 and was assassinated?
It's so interesting that you raised that, because I think that was maybe one of the main things I learned from the book. I like biographies. I'm very interested in the role of individuals in history, but I'm not a sort of Thomas Carlyle type believer in, like the great man. Sometimes these things are very decisive. And I think that I used to think of the Kennedy assassination as something that was strange, mysterious, and kind of demoralizing, but people must have got on just fine. The country didn't seem to change its trajectory too much. I no longer think that. I think that the Kennedy assassination was a real pivot on which history shifted. I think Kennedy was at heart a much more conservative person than Lyndon Johnson. And he would have proceeded more slowly in Johnson's two great projects, civil rights and Vietnam.
And Johnson's third project, the Great Society, the social welfare reforms, is that equally important as those two?
Yes, it is. But I believe the Great Society is basically a dressed up way of creating the economic and social basis for the reforms that civil rights law was going to bring into place. That is, you couldn't sort of like, you couldn't carry out civil rights if you were going to have like the same economic inequality. So you had to like move a lot of money, you had to build a lot of housing, you had to, build a lot of roads, you had to really do a lot. So I think it's a third thing, but it's closely linked to civil rights.
Right, before we get into all of this, and we will really dig into the 1960s, fascinating era, let's talk a bit about the 50s beforehand to get a bit of context. It was the era of Eisenhower and Nixon, obviously, as vice president. What was America like in the 1950s? What was the American psyche like? Were we just as, well, I say we, were you just as...
Good for you. Yeah. Good for you. I like that. That's one of the wonderful things about this country, actually. Is
I've only been here about a month.
Exactly. God bless you. Yeah.
Were you just as hubristic as you claim as America was in the 1960s? What was the 50s like? Can you just talk a bit about the 50s?
Well, I wasn't there, but I've been very fascinated by the history of that period. Yes, the hubris that I describe was very slow in forming. After the Second World War, you remember when the United States went into the Second World War out of a really intractable depression. And a lot of people worry that once the war ended, the war and the war economy ended, we would be back in recession. And so you had a very funny situation. You had a people, you had a nation of people who were very frugal and very suspicious. And then you had a nation of sort of these huge factories that had been built out during the war that were like pumping out cars, thousands a day and trying to sell them. And you had television. And so eventually they broke the country down and turned it into the sort of like hedonistic flesh pot that it now is today. You know what I mean? The 50s they were a time of transition in that regard. I'd say a couple of things about the 50s that are generally underappreciated. One is it was a time of a tremendous intellectual blossoming. I mean, partly because so much of the intellectual personnel of Europe had fled here, during the Second World War. So it was not only the intellectual capital of the world in its own right, but it also had half the intellectual life of every European capital. And so it was, if you read the books that came out of the United States and in the 1950s, read like, I don't know, the origins of totalitarianism, or capitalism, socialism, and democracy, or the end of ideology, or they're great. This is like really, so it was maybe the apex of American culture. The second thing I would say about the 1950s, though, is that a particular corner of the hubris had to do with sex, and it had to do with men and women. Basically, you had a country that had really been failing in the 1930s, and it was really full of distrust, and no one believed in any institutions. And suddenly you had you had a military that went out and defeated two gigantic powers on two continents, and and did so in such a way that we built 190,000 warplanes in World War II. I mean, it's just sort of like these incredible things. And so it not only made the country feel like we're really great, it also made individual men in the macho sense think we're really great. And so if you look at, one of the great books from this intellectual flowering, which is Betty Friedan's The Feminist Mystique from 1963. It's the first book of American second wave feminism, and she's got kind of a gripe. She just as a woman, she doesn't really feel right in the American suburbs, you know what I mean? But what's the problem? It's not the age-old problem of men mistreating their women. It's a really new thing. If you look at the statistics, you find that the men coming back from the war, they were all offered scholarships. They pushed the women out of college. So there was a tremendous retrogression of women and their social position in the 1950s. That was a huge powder keg that was really set to go off in the 1960s and 70s. But no one could really talk about it because it had to do with our great performance in the war.
So in the 50s, are you seeing the kind of seeds of the revolutionary ideas that are just about to explode in America?
I think so. Yeah. You see a lot of, the beatniks are like proto-hippies, and the folk music movement is starting up, and people begin to question just corporations and mass production and how standardized and uniform everything is, and sort of people begin to think that the country was actually better before it was so efficient.
A figure like Eisenhower is fascinating to me. He seemed incredibly well respected by Americans of all political persuasions. Obviously, he stood as a Republican. Maybe he could have stood as a Democrat. I know the Democrats asked him to stand as their nominee. And he, as I said, he's well respected. He's a war hero. He's a veteran. He seems competent. And there certainly was a kind of level of moral, morality and integrity that he seemed to kind of give off. And if you compare that to a figure like Johnson, a figure like JFK, there seems to be a big contrast there. Yeah. So that trust in the institution of the president and just in institutions in general, do you see a shift in American attitudes from the 1950s with Eisenhower to the 1960s with those two figures, and then maybe even with Nixon as well?
Yes. You have to take them in turn. FDR is simply the most beloved president in American history. He was very divisive. He was very, what used to be called populist. That is, in the Julius Caesar sense, right? He favored the many over the few, but the many were many, and they really gave him big majorities. And he saved the country from depression as people understood it. He won a war. And the most important thing that he did was he took this massive, indigestible looking lot of people of various ethnicities who were still living their separate ways, and he totally assimilated them into American life, to the point that by the 1960s, you know, these people's children were comparing that everyone in America is the same. You know what I mean? They came from like, you know, 50 different countries, but everyone says, oh, it's so boring here. Everyone's exactly the same. But that was FDR's great thing. Eisenhower is maybe our most underrated president. He was a man of serious intellect. You know, I think he had two brothers. He was a college president, and he had a brother who was a college president. I think his brother was the president of one of the Midwestern State Universities, I think the University of Kansas. He was a beautiful writer. In his early days in the army, he had researched the World War II battles, and he had an encyclopedic mind in a lot of ways. But he was mild-mannered. He was like a very easygoing guy, and he was a liberal Republican. He was a great moderating influence. He was a terrific president. Between them is Harry Truman, who I think may be our most overrated president. Today, he is beloved because people who, I don't know, he was brassy. He asserted America's place on the world stage. People really but he dragged us into a war that went very badly in Korea, and people at the time did not think very highly of him. Okay, but let's just say, in general, the Roosevelt-Eisenhower period was a very impressive. It was a very impressive period, and I would say that the closest thing to a continuation of that period was probably Nixon. I mean, Nixon had a very serious sense of the presidency as a statesman-like, as a place for real statesmanship, as a place where you know where you know, as a place that Nixon had a serious sense of the statesman-like responsibilities of the White House.
Let's talk about JFK. You say that his assassination was a turning point in American history. So you view him as essentially a conservative figure in terms of the Democratic Party. How do you assess his legacy?
I'd say he's conservative within the Democratic Party. I don't think he's conservative altogether. He was above ideology in a lot of ways. He represented actually like, okay, now we're going to move into the future. This is like, it's maybe a sign of hubris, but people really liked it, you know? People loved his beautiful wife. They loved the artists that he invited to the White House. You know, he like invited Pablo Casals to the White House to play the cello. He invited poets to read him his poetry. And he was just like, he was really cool. He was like, and other politicians have tried to do that since. I think maybe the ones that come to mind are Pierre Elliott Trudeau and his son, Justin. Both tried to do the same trick. And Emmanuel Macron. But it's a really hard thing to be. You can't really do it unless you're the head of the superpower. I mean, there was something very special about it. And it's not just a retrospective nostalgia. Americans, although I was not there, Americans were very conscious of it at the time.
He was young, he was handsome, he was charismatic.
He was witty, he was funny.
And the lines that he spoke, the kind of, I don't know if it was speechwriters or him, but they're memorable. Yeah. You remember those famous quips in his inaugural address and so on, even today. Yeah. And some people argue that Jackie actually invented this kind of Camelot myth around the White House and really kind of enshrined JFK's legacy in the American mind as this kind of amazing guy. Do you think that that's true to an extent? Do you think that he's sort of overhyped because of his deaths when he was so young?
Well, it's hard to say how it would have come out. I mean, he certainly made a few mistakes. In 1961, he led a bunch of Cuban revolutionaries trying to overthrow Fidel Castro, the newly installed communist dictator in Cuba. He led them to believe that the United States would back them up if they invaded, and there was a miscommunication of some kind or a loss of will at the last moment, and a lot of these guys were killed on the beach, and it didn't really look very good. We wound up in, whether you blame that for what happened the following year in the Cuban Missile Crisis is another question. Most people think that Kennedy came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that is actually the confrontation between Russia and the United States about whether Russia would remove its missiles from Cuba. Most people think he came out of the negotiation pretty well.
Because at the time there was a lot of pressure on him from his cabinet, from his vice president, from generals to actually bomb Cuba, to bomb these sites, to really escalate things. And he and his brother de-escalated things and prevented a war from happening.
Uh-huh. Well, that sounds right, but I haven't made a close study of it. But I'd say the other big mistake he made was that he drifted into, he allowed the United States to drift into too close a relationship with the government of Vietnam. And
Of South Vietnam.
Yes, if you read of South Vietnam, right? If you read Ronald Steele's book about Bobby Kennedy, RFK the Elder, it has some very interesting passages about just the Kennedy's idea of machismo and sort of like wanting to have a real robust foreign policy. It's almost like a French-style foreign policy where you're kind of like constantly raiding small countries. And so they were trying to whip the country into, engaging Laos in a war. And that didn't fly, and so they sent advisors to Vietnam. And then there was a coup that the United States approved that wound up in the murder of the leader of the country, and those things were not going well. But he would have been reelected, and the country would have gone on a more moderate path, and it might have, it probably wouldn't have avoided a lot of upheavals in the 60s, because I think a lot of those had to do with the demographic, just the energy that just came from the demographic power of the baby boom. So that would most likely have happened, but it would have taken a different form.
So, as you say, 1963 November, JFK is killed in Dallas, and Lyndon Johnson becomes president. How important is Lyndon Johnson as a figure in American politics? What is his legacy today?
Well, at that point, you would have said that he was probably the greatest Senate Majority Leader who had ever lived. He was a guy who, in the 1950s, dominated the Senate and left his mark on every single piece of legislation that went through it. And no one had ever seen his like. Who tried to run for president half-heartedly in 1960, didn't get very far. Just he was not that type of leader. He's not the kind of person who inspired warm feelings in the voting public. But Kennedy made him his vice presidential, pick.
And crucially, he's a Southerner.
He's a Southerner.
That's part of the calculation from Kennedy.
He's a Texan, yes. So that's Johnson up to 1963. But in 1964, he basically passes a number of pieces of legislation that I would argue basically refounded the country. It was like a a hinge moment, rather like the Civil War of 1861 to 65, and which led to a kind of a refounding of the country with the drafting of the 14th Amendment. These were not constitutional amendments, but they were laws that, and I'm talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration Reform Act, the introduction of Medicare, the closest thing we have to a national health system, and the Great Society, and then the opening up of immigration to the world, which has utterly changed the country. So he's one of the most, quite by accident, he wound up in a position to make himself one of the most important handful of people who's ever lived in the United States.
To what extent was he riding the wave of the 60s, the mood of the era, the mood of the decade? And to what extent did he shape that decade through his own personality, through his own beliefs, through the people around him?
Not at all. And what he was riding was the grief of the public over Kennedy. So when he introduced legislation in 1964, whether it was a tax cut that Kennedy had proposed before, or the Civil Rights Act itself, he would say, "I can think of no greater monument to our slain leader than this law," and that, I think, is the explanation for his landslide victory in 1964, because 2 years later, the country just totally turned on him, and the moment the Voting Rights Act was passed, you had riots across the country. You had, you had student protests. You had protests over Vietnam, and a lot of people say Johnson withdrew in 1968 because he was aware that he divided the country over Vietnam and things. He chose not to run in 1968 because he was going to lose, and so he did some hugely important things over the course of about 18 months. He sort of like landed in the lap of destiny, and he knew what to do. But after that, he was totally out of sync with that decade.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964, probably one of the most famous pieces of legislation, I would say, ever passed in American history. Something that is taught in schools, I'm sure in America, but certainly in the United Kingdom, as a kind of foundational moment against racism, almost when discrimination died from a legal perspective. Can you talk about what that act did, both de jure and de facto, and the consequences of that legislation on American culture and society?
Yeah. De jure, what it did was it criminalized certain behaviors in government action. So you couldn't run a segregated swimming pool, which is what the Kennedy Civil Rights Act had envisioned. But it also criminalized a lot of discrimination in large private enterprises. And it gave government a role to look into the hiring practices of companies, even if they were not found to have committed a crime. It also told these companies that they could avoid being looked at if they would set up affirmative action programs. It passed some voting laws, which were expanded in the Voting Rights Act the following year, and it gave suing powers. It created offices of civil rights in almost every cabinet agency in the country, and it gave the federal government the power to sue local agencies and schools if they were felt to be violating the law. And it gave individuals the power to sue people if they felt they were being discriminated against. So it was just this. It's a strange thing. It didn't really have. It wasn't something that was enforced by the police. It tended to be enforced in civil court, and as a result, no one really knows what it does, and no one really knows what its limits are. But people are scared to death of it because they can see that what happens to people who get accused of being a racist and that kind of thing, you know? So
You call it a parallel constitution, or words similar to that effect. Why?
the old Constitution sort of consists of laws passed by Congress and signed by the president. Now there was a new way of getting things done. A person who felt himself poorly done by could sue a company and get the company to open up its books. And so this suing, this use of suing, both by the government and by private parties, became a shortcut to people who felt they were being unfairly treated. And that very quickly led to a total upheaval in a lot of the basic institutions of the workplace.
So this ability to sue private companies because of discrimination created, I suppose, a difficulty for companies, because what is discrimination? And do you think that has basically been poorly defined, too vague, and the mere fact of a company, let's say a company has 99% of people are white men, does that mean that the company is automatically discriminatory against minorities or women? So is that the issues that you're talking about?
It's very vague, and no one knows whether this company, which is 99% white men, is going to be measured against the population of rural Alaska, which is 99% white men, or the population of rural Alabama, which is 30% white men, let's say. I mean, there are rules that govern these things, but no one knows what they are. And so people live in a constant state of incertitude and fear. They can be sued, it seems to them, for almost anything. So, for instance, there's a very famous case in 1971 called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but it's a case that involved the Duke Power Company gave a test, a multiple choice test, just to, it was, I don't know whether it was an intelligence test or a writing test or whatever, but a group of black applicants to the Duke Power Company claimed that this test was keeping them from to be able to compete in a fair way for the job. And the people at the Duke Power Company said, well, look, this is our business. We can set the rules for our business as we like, and we feel that this test is necessary to get the right employees. But the Supreme Court overturned it forced them to do without the test under in this landmark case, which created, there's a lot of interesting things about this case, but it created the standard that's called disparate impact, which is the one that you're talking about, where, if a measure that a company has taken, like a test, okay, is excluding proportionately more minorities than it is white people, then it's prima facie invalid unless the company can come forward and show exactly why it's needed. So it's really a total reversal of the presumption of innocence. It's a totally new way of doing a constitution.
So essentially, if there is unequal outcomes or unequal representation, that is automatically, under the Civil Rights Act, potentially explained by racism and discrimination.
Yes. Yes, and if you are vulnerable to a claim of racism, and that's what that particular case did, and that's actually what that particular case did was. So what happens is that a mere statistical difference can serve as grounds for a suit for racism, and that is not what Americans thought they were getting into when the Civil Rights Act was passed. I mean, Americans thought they knew what a racist was. It was, someone who's defending Southern segregation and talking angrily and hated minorities. Or they didn't realize that over time, the Civil Rights Act would be refined by both bureaucratic rules and judicial decisions to become much, much more intrusive than anything that they'd ever imagined.
So racism became a passive definition rather than something that's actively done to someone.
That's really a good way to put it. Yes. So you could wake up in the morning not knowing if you were a racist and not knowing if anything you were doing that day, even with the best will in the world, would lead you to be considered one.
The Civil Rights Act, as I said earlier, it seems to have a kind of religious commitment from the elites in the United States, and as I said in the UK, it really is taught as this like.
I'd say everyone really. It is a religious thing, and it's a doctrinal thing, and the kids are all taught it in school.
And that's presumably partly because America does have a terrible history of racism, does have a history of slavery, does have Jim Crow laws, and something that is seen as the turning and defining moment, the sort of turning point against all of that stuff, it has been raised onto this kind of pedestal.
But the strange thing is, that's the way it is now taught now. That is not the way Americans understood it in 1964. And this is one of the interesting ironies. Americans looked at, there were a lot of protests going on in Mississippi and Alabama then, in the very deep South. Americans did not think of themselves as a country that had a big problem with racism. Americans thought of themselves as a country that had a region that had a big problem with racism. There were about 4 states that were, almost a parody of how people, dealt with race. And I'd say those were certainly Alabama and Mississippi, maybe Louisiana, and maybe South Carolina. The other states, while they varied in their degree of racism, let's say there's a handful of them, like the Georgias, the Virginia, Kentucky,
Texas,
yeah, they were all evolving. I mean, they all had a history of racism, but they were modernizing. So I think that the degree of the crisis, I'm not saying it wasn't a crisis, it was a crisis, but it was a local crisis, and it was not as large a crisis as it's understood to be today.
Now, the question I have to ask is, how do we deal with the consequences of the Civil Rights Act today? As I said, it's untouchable, in the minds of many. Certainly this issue of reforming, repealing, changing the Civil Rights Act is incredibly controversial, but suddenly it seems to be more of a mainstream idea among certain conservatives. I know certainly perhaps your book probably aided in this. So what do we do about the Civil Rights Act and the consequences that it has had on America?
I don't know. I am not a politician or a policymaker. So I don't. But I will say that I think that the largest unintended consequence that the Civil Rights Act has had is that the incertitude around what constitutes racism or sexism or now homophobia or transphobia, the incertitude about this leads to tremendous self-censorship, because another thing that's happened over the last century is you've had court doctrines that allow people to sue for when they feel there's a hostile environment or when they feel uncomfortable in a place. So, you can say, as a woman, I just feel uncomfortable having a boss who has that painting with the nude hanging behind his desk. And I'm not saying the boss is not a jerk, maybe he is, but this sort of thing didn't used to be a thing of law. It used to be considered a form of expression in which the state had no business to intervene, okay? So that's like a calendar in a shop. But when it comes to universities, and when people say, I'm feeling threatened because, this person is teaching this or that, and, it's very constricting. It's become very constricting to freedom of expression.
And certainly freedom of association is another area which seems to have been completely shut down, according to your book, in terms of the Civil Rights Act.
Well, freedom of association was meant to be shut down by the Civil Rights Act. In our Constitution, the First Amendment includes a whole bunch of freedoms jumbled together. It's got, freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. Most jurors, most judges, most Supreme Court justices, until the Civil Rights Act, understood freedom of assembly to mean freedom of association. But obviously, if the government can come to your company and say, we don't like who you've been hiring, there really is the freedom of association is a dead letter. So yes, that was the direct price that was the main thing that the Civil Rights Act did. It reinterpreted the First Amendment to narrow the idea of freedom of assembly so that it no longer included freedom of association.
And that seems bizarre that the Civil Rights Act could pass and not be seen as unconstitutional in that way. And I know that at the time, certainly Southern senators, Richard Russell of Georgia, were making these arguments around freedom of association, and they lost that argument. I mean,
that was during the vote, and he got rolled over by Lyndon Johnson. It was, Lyndon Johnson came back to the Senate and sort of like became the Senate majority leader that he was again. But yeah, and afterward there were challenges to it on that ground. I think that there was now so much, let's say, spiritual momentum behind this that it was unrevisitable by the court. But they're not these things were not examined terribly closely at the time. That's certainly true.
And just finally on the civil rights stuff, because I do want to move on, and there's so many other things I want to talk about, but in terms of its impact on the so-called woke movement, DEI, diversity, equality and inclusion, the rise of affirmative action, what we've seen at Harvard with the Supreme Court case with the Asian Americans who are suing Harvard for discrimination, where does the Civil Rights Act come into all of these cultural debates we've had in the last 10 years?
Well, the Harvard Asian debate is just that's a pretty direct application of the Civil Rights Act. That's if there had been Asians in the United States in 1965, you could have advanced that case in just the same way. It was a case of racial discrimination. And the court came up with a decision that I don't know how effective it's going to be in changing Harvard's policy. University of North Carolina has changed its policy, which is the other university sued in that case. But I don't know if Harvard will in any serious way. The woke is a more interesting question because woke is the development over time of activists' understanding of how they can weaponize the civil rights laws. So, the civil rights laws were understood to be, there's only, to deal with cases like, look, there's only one factory in this town, and there are a lot of black people who want to work there, and the factory owner just hates black people and he won't hire them, and that it's that kind of case. But there weren't like speech cases that were coming out of civil rights. Now you have things like, the woke is when, like, at a university, the Black Students Association says, we are made uncomfortable by what this person says, and if you invite him to the campus, we'll sue you. And then we'll shut it down. And if you remove us from the scene too aggressively, we'll sue you. And so let's just say it's a ripening of the enforcement possibilities of civil rights into the speech area. That's all woke is.
There's so many ironies as well. I mean, you talk about universities and sort of black organizations within them creating things like safe spaces where only black people are allowed to congregate and white people aren't allowed there because they make them feel so-called unsafe, which is just such a similarity to what the Jim Crow era had, with segregation and so on. So, but they can't see it in that way.
There is a sort of a reverse racism in some ways. But I will say, I am not. I think that it's. I'm not averse to, the Black Students Association wanting to keep itself limited to black students or something like that. I mean, if they were
averse to it if it was the other way around.
That's the problem with the laws as they are employed now. I mean, there is a de facto asymmetry in the way they are enforced, depending on the group that's committing the infraction. And
what's your view? Just to answer that question. I know it's a controversial.
Yeah. I tend to be a big. I tend to favor a maximum of freedom of association, but in a private association, not. I believe that all citizens should be treated equally. You know what I mean? But I mean, it's sort of like if there's it's coming up in the, in the Columbia protests of whether whether the Jewish students can congregate over here and whether the Palestinian students can congregate over there. And I really don't object to that as long as they treat each other with respect and aren't violent to one another.
Right, let's move on from civil rights. It's such an interesting subject, but also other major events in the 60s. You talk about Vietnam. To what extent was that a check on the hubris that you talked about earlier of America and American power? And how much of an impact did that war have in the long term? Or, was that sort of confined to the 60s and the 70s, or does it still have a lasting impact today?
I don't know if it, well, for about 3 decades, it had or let's say for about 2 decades, it had a tremendous impact. It stopped that hubris in its tracks. It's actually very similar to how Americans responded to having lost 100,000 or more young men in World War I. Let's not do that again. You know what I mean? I mean, there was a tremendous, I wouldn't say hostility, just a tremendous caution about sending American troops abroad or talking about sending American troops abroad. And when George H.W. Bush in 1991 said, attacked Iraq and sort of achieved a very swift and sort of total victory, it appeared, aside from leaving Saddam Hussein in power. There were marches in the streets in Washington, and everyone said, we've cured ourselves of the Vietnam syndrome, as if the reluctance to go forth in search of monsters to slay was kind of like a form of mental illness. Do you know what I mean? Once that happened, once the Iraq War happened, there was a tendency to do a lot more of these things. Bush went and sent the army the elder Bush sent the army to Somalia. Clinton intervened in the Balkans, and pretty soon we were what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation. And we were going to war everywhere, and we're ordering the world everywhere. And an interesting thing that happened that we saw in 2003 is that all of these wars look like Vietnam. And so you wonder if it might lead you to revisit Vietnam. What was Vietnam? Was it just like a dumb idea in the 1960s? Or was it the first war that the United States tried to fight as a global policeman? And that's what I'd say it was. That's why we haven't won a war. And
you mentioned Sputnik, the Russian satellite that went into space, that really put America on its toes, as it were. Sort of got you enthusiastic. You mentioned earlier, hubristic as well. But in 1969, America put the first man on the moon. What impact does that have on the American psyche?
that was great. That's just totally consistent with the way we thought about ourselves. And then we did it several more times. And then I believe 1972, we made the last moon mission, and it was announced that we wouldn't do that again for a while. And now people ask whether we would be capable of doing it today. China, I think, has said that it wants to have a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And I think India has made sent the last successful rocket to the moon. But that's not the kind of thing we really do anymore, for better and for worse.
The other great legacy of Lyndon Johnson is his Great Society, sort of really investing in welfare, similar to socialized countries in Western Europe. How do you assess the impact of the Great Society and these welfare legislation that he passed in the 1960s?
It really divided the country. Crime rose to unprecedented heights in the 1970s, and rightly or wrongly, probably rightly to a degree, the country blamed a lot of it on welfare. They thought that aid to families with dependent children, which was the very serious program, was leading women in the inner city to have a whole bunch of children by multiple fathers, and that these children, when they grew up fatherless and really not really tended to, had a tendency to crime. And so this argument was very, it sometimes took the form of caricature, but it was, until the Democrats addressed it, they were never going to win a presidential election. And so Bill Clinton took that bull by the horns in the 1992 campaign, and just before his 1996 reelection, he passed welfare reform, which is basically applied only to this aid to families with dependent children program. There's a lot of other welfare programs, but it was a very important start. And whether this is related or not, around the same time, crime began to fall dramatically. So that was the end of that chapter in American life.
You also mentioned immigration earlier, this Immigration Act in 1965. Again, just assessing the legacy of the 60s, assessing the legacy of that legislation. How does immigration change in the 1960s, and what's the long-term impact of that?
At the outset, it was primarily an English country in the 18th century, with a few Scots, a few Germans. In the 19th century, you had some Irish, some Germans, particularly after 1848. And then, starting in the 1880s, as the country began to expand, the whole of Europe poured into the United States. I forget how many people came, but it was in the tens of millions. and they multiply. And, they just spread out across the country very quickly. And so it became a kind of a pan-European country. It, it's the main groups in this second wave were, with a few Scandinavians, particularly Swedes, Poles, Russians, Jews, various Slavs from Central Europe, Italians, Greeks, few Middle Easterners, but really it became Europe, with a couple of exceptions. That seemed to work pretty well, but not well enough for the public. The public, even though this influx of people was quite necessary if you were going to settle this entire continent, the public never liked it because they saw that it was totally changing their culture. And it was a lot like today. And it took about 30 or 40 years before the public finally prevailed on Congress to slam the doors shut. I think it was in 1924. And so the United States had a very, very limited number of immigrants every year. There were fewer than 1 million immigrants in the United States the whole time, after 1925. One of the things I mentioned in my book is that by 1970, you had the lowest percentage of immigrants in the history of the United States. Only 4% of Americans were foreign born. So what happened in 1965 is that for largely ideological reasons, because our immigration policy was thought to be inconsistent with the spirit of the civil rights laws, it was decided not to discriminate against non-Europeans in the migration. And the rules for migration were both liberalized, they were changed, and then they were liberalized. The gates were thrown open. It was all politicians who backed this measure said it's gonna affect the country only at the margins. But that was a country back then that was smaller than 200,000. But the country has pretty much doubled in size since then. So it did have a somewhat larger effect than people said.
Okay, so we've talked about the Civil Rights Act, we've talked about immigration, we've talked about social welfare, we've talked about the Vietnam War. These are all major changes and caused major long-lasting impacts in American life at all levels. One thing we haven't talked about is the sexual revolution, and certainly that seems to be hanging over all of the topics we've been discussing, and definitely was another major turning point in the 1960s. But just to summarize the interview, one last kind of question, or questions I guess. How did the Conservatives react to the 1960s? How did Nixon and how did Reagan change what happened under Lyndon Johnson? Did they reform? Did they reverse? Did they put in place conservative policies? I know certainly Reagan could perhaps be criticized for this. So can you talk about the conservative reaction to these major changes that occurred in the 60s?
Nixon and Reagan reacted differently. Nixon's reaction was focused on crime. That was like a direct, that was what he felt was an issue that was directly impacting voters and really worrying them. So he vowed to be tough on crime, and that's basically the extent of what he did. In his heart, Nixon did not believe that the New Deal could be overturned. And in fact, at the time, this was before the great deindustrialization and before the outsourcing. And Nixon's departure from office coincided almost exactly with the Arab oil embargo and the great economic reversal of fortune of the West. So for most of Nixon's time in office, it was a healthy economy, which Nixon didn't really want to mess with. And so he was very Nixon was very interventionist in the economy. He in 1971, when there was inflation, he froze wages and prices, something no president would do today.
And just, sorry to interrupt, and I want you to continue answering the question, but just a little caveat here with Nixon and Johnson. One thing I forgot to ask. Johnson very much degraded the office of the president. He lied and he lied and he lied. And people saw him in that way and saw him through that lens, very much as being, having basically no integrity. Can you just talk very briefly about how Nixon and Johnson compared on that point?
That's interesting. I would say that Johnson was a real, he was a real backroom politician, and he did a lot of things to get things done. He was very foreign to most Americans who were not from Texas, and he looked very suspicious. But I would say actually that in terms of a reputation for lying, Nixon had a much greater reputation for lying. I'm not saying
they called it the credibility gap, didn't they?
Yes, but I'm not saying it's exactly fair. But Nixon, starting in the 1950s, made himself a real enemy of the press and of a lot of elites in the United States, because he was a real anti-communist, and he really led the fight against a State Department employee who was thought to have communist ties, named Alger Hiss, who was he had been a law clerk for Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was like a real member of the Georgetown elite. Nixon was always considered like a kind of like an upstart, down market kind of common fellow compared to his enemies. And so he was really savaged in the press in a way that Johnson was not. So in terms of who was the more honest man, well, neither, you wouldn't trust any of them. They're politicians, okay? Maybe Nixon was marginally the more honest, but that was not his reputation in the country. I mean, I do not think that when Nixon replaced Johnson, people thought they were trading up ethically.
No, absolutely, I agree with that. I thought it was an interesting point, because Johnson, I think, well, according to Caro, Johnson's biographer, he says that Johnson really degraded the office of the presidency, and he lied about Vietnam constantly in terms of, was America winning that war and so on. And people really saw the office of the president as being this amazing institution with much integrity, and then he kind of fell under his reign. It
wasn't really fully understood just how duplicitous he had been until he was out of office. People thought that he was waging this huge war without any idea of why, but they didn't realize that they never believed they could win it either.
Getting back to this issue of conservatives reacting to the 1960s, I'll let you continue your answer. So you talked about Nixon. He was focused on crime.
Yeah, what I'd say is that Nixon really governed at a time when the Roosevelt consensus seemed very robust. That's why Nixon said, "We are all Keynesians now." Nixon believed that he basically had to pick up where the Democrats left off in terms of economic policy. He did not like Johnson's welfare plans, but he did not move against them either. So Nixon was, that idea of rolling back the welfare state, the time was not ripe for that. And in fact, Reagan said that was what he wanted to do. And when Reagan came to power, you'd had another 5, 6, 7 years of decline. You'd also had a massive loss of jobs, and the country had come to think that the government said it was too focused on other things to run the economy. And so it brought Reagan in to pare the state back. And the thing about Reagan is his coalition. I mean, his coalition was one of businessmen on one hand, and you know, moralistic people. You might call them Christians, you might call them rural people, on the other hand. And what ultimately happened is that the businessmen had a voice in Washington and the common people of the United States. And so Reaganism developed the way it did. There really wasn't much done to roll back the 1960s. A lot was done to cut taxes. A lot was done to expand the military. But again, the culture of the 60s was pretty much allowed to roll.
And I suspect has been rolling ever since. Thank you so much, Christopher Caldwell, for joining us. I appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure, Stephen.